Welcome to Love and Abuse, the show about helping you identify poisonous communication and toxic behavior. You deserve to be treated with respect and kindness. That's why it's important that you learn to pinpoint manipulative and controlling behavior so that you keep your power and your sanity. I'm your host, Paul Coliani. All information on the show is meant for educational purposes only. Always seek a professional for your mental health and well-being. And thanks for joining me. Thanks for joining for another episode of Love and Abuse. I want to comment on something that has to do with incompatibility and how incompatibility can lead to emotionally abusive behavior because we want someone to be more like us or be less like they are. That can happen. If we want someone to be more introverted because we're an extrovert, then that could lead to destructive behavior. If we want them to be more extroverted because we're introverted, same thing. If somebody likes sci-fi and the other person likes romantic movies, things like that, even though they're small, they can be little compounding nudges or digs at the other person that build up into worse behavior over time. And of course, with any type of control, manipulation, or emotional abuse, when you have something small like this, it's usually part of a bigger pattern. Because you could have, for example, someone in a romantic relationship smokes, but the other one doesn't. In fact, might hate smoking. The person who hates the smoking is always going to have that in the back of their mind, or they're going to smell smoke and they're going to be triggered, they're going to be angry. And I'm just laying out a scenario. This doesn't mean everyone that has this kind of relationship where one smokes and one doesn't has this going on, but this is an example of what can happen, is that you can have someone that does a behavior that the other person doesn't like, and the person who doesn't like it starts to build more and more resistance to that behavior. And it creates a pattern where they're more upset, more triggered or triggerable, where they might get triggered easily. And this can build over the weeks, months, and years that you're around this person. And an example of this, besides the smoking, is drinking. A lot of couples that have an alcoholic in the home experience this. When the person drinks, they hate it, and they can't wait for it to be over. And then the next day they're sober, but the person who doesn't drink, the person who doesn't want the other person to drink, is constantly thinking about the other person drinking, or hoping they won't drink, hoping they won't pick up the alcohol this time. And that continues to be an emotional trigger that is not only present, but is also amplifying over time. And then you end up with this low-level underlying stress and anxiety, hoping the other person doesn't drink. And it's the same thing with bad behavior. Any type of controlling, manipulative, abusive behavior that the other person does, the person that's not doing that behavior feels like they can't do anything right or say anything right. They feel like they can't be themselves because the other person could go off at any moment or make them feel bad about themselves or put them down for something. And so you get that walking on eggshells feeling. This is what happens when you have the type of incompatibility I'm talking about, is that one person shows up to the relationship in a certain way, and the other person shows up in a relationship in a certain way. And unless you agree on the small compromises where you can meet in the middle, abusive behavior can form. If you are in any type of relationship where there is difficult or bad behavior going on, then I would ask you, what subject matter came up in the beginning that started to create the rift and the bad behavior? Because if you can find the root of it, you can maybe have a conversation about it. For me, when I was married, it was like a week after I met my future wife. When we met, she told me she had a sugar addiction. And I laughed it off. I thought everyone had a sugar addiction. I thought everyone loved sweets and loved ice cream, and I just thought that was normal for people. What I didn't know is that she was serious. She was really addicted to it. She was an emotional eater. She ate junk food when she felt certain emotions come up. And I didn't know that until later, but she told me that at the beginning, and I didn't take it as seriously as she meant it. But I found out not too long after that, just a few days later, when we went out to eat, and I saw her eat more than what I would call a normal serving of something. And when I saw that, I thought, wow, she must be serious. I didn't take it seriously, but she must be serious. And at that time, I had already developed feelings for her. We had already been talking on the phone for months because we had an online relationship before this. And when we met and we got to know each other a bit better, we were already really deeply connected by that point. And when she told me about this and then I saw it in the restaurant, I developed an emotional trigger. From that point on, from that day, I had this emotional trigger buried inside of me that came up every time she reached for anything sweet, anything with sugar, or even any junk food. I just started generalizing it like all junk food, all bad food, all unhealthy food was a bad thing for her. So my judgments came up. And, I didn't overtly say things to her, but I'd give her that look and I would say things passive aggressively. And I did a lot of very, very toxic behaviors back then because I had that trigger inside of me. So this is what can happen, is that there's one or two things that can start the pattern of emotional abuse. For me, it was seeing her do that. And of course, we continued the relationship and I kept being judgmental and I kept being critical, and it was awful for her. Because after many years of that, it disintegrates the love and connection. It hurts the other person. I'm telling you this, I've told this story before. I talked about judgment on this show and my other show, The Overwhelmed Brain. I just republished an article called Judgment, the Ultimate Relationship Destroyer. If you want to check that out on medium.com, you can look for my profile. You'll see The Overwhelmed Brain or Paul Coliani. And I talk about how I destroyed all the relationships in my life, all the romantic ones, by being so judgmental. And how in 2013, I realized that now that my marriage is ending, there must be something wrong with me because all my relationships are ending in a bad way. They're leaving me. So I should probably look at myself and what I need to do to fix me, to heal me. And when I went on that journey, that's when I finally healed from being judgmental. So that article might be helpful to you if you're dealing with judgment in your relationships. But my point in this episode is to think of a time, if you're in any type of difficult relationship, think of a time before things got difficult. And what type of incompatibility, if I may call it that, was present at that time. For me, I didn't want to be with an addict because I lived with an addict the first 20 years of my life. My stepfather was an addict, and I hated that behavior. I didn't want to deal with that behavior, and so I had a judgment against that behavior. So when I fell in love with an addict, I immediately became triggered and immediately became judgmental, and from that point on, my behavior toward her changed. I was no longer unconditionally loving. Not that I was ever unconditional, but I would believe I was much more supportive, much more loving, much more caring, much more generous and compassionate toward her before I became triggered. Because I believe that most abusive, if not all abusive people, carry around some sort of emotional trigger that sets them off. Some sort of stimuli in their environment or the person they're with sets them off. And it had to start somewhere. For me, it was when I was a child. I was growing up with an addict. So I held on to that unhealed part of myself, and I brought it into all of my adult relationships. And anyone that did anything that reminded me of that addictive-like behavior, I became highly judgmental toward. So figuring that out in my own life helped me heal from the judgment. I mean, it wasn't just figuring it out. It was a process. And I outlined that process in that article. But once I figured it out, my relationships changed dramatically. In fact, since my marriage ended because of my judgments, because of I was so critical about her challenge in her life, since then, I've been a completely different person, and I'm not carrying around this feeling that I used to have in my stomach. I used to have this anger and anxiety and just all this negativity that I carried around in my stomach because I was always waiting for the stimuli that triggered that emotional response in me. When I was married, I watched her and I was waiting for her to do the quote bad behavior so that I could remind her in subtle ways, passive-aggressive ways, that it was bad for her and bad for us, and I didn't like it, and she should change. I never really said those exact words, but I might as well have. I might as well have just been more direct like that, even though it was still hurtful and toxic. But my point here is that I went my entire life with this emotional trigger inside of me, and it lied dormant until somebody in my life did something that reminded me of that old behavior that my stepfather used to do, and then I became a watchdog. I became on guard, and my radar was on, and I was always looking for any sign or signal of that bad behavior so that I could point it out or manipulate or make the other person feel bad for doing it. I don't say this with any pride. I say this in a very vulnerable way, knowing that there are people out there that have dealt with people like me, at least in my past, and I'm here to say that it is curable. You can heal. One can heal from being emotionally abusive. It is possible. But the abuser, the abusive person, has to admit that they need to heal. They have to admit it, at least if not to you, to themselves. They have to admit to themselves that they are the common denominator for the issues in their relationship. And when they admit that, then the healing can start. They can look for counseling. They can read articles or listen to podcasts like mine and see that other people have gone through healing. And I'll say this, it's not easy. In fact, it's so hard. It's like a fish trying to breathe air for the first time. They won't be able to do it. In fact, a fish can't breathe air. That's probably a bad example, but let's just say that a fish learned how to breathe air. You might realize how difficult that would be. You know, if they didn't have gills and they develop lungs, it would be very difficult for a fish to transition out of the water and into the air. That's what it's like. Not everyone can make that journey. I made that journey, but it was the most difficult journey in my life because it involved changing my very identity and being the most vulnerable. I hate to say it felt emasculating. It felt like it was taking away my manhood. And that even sounds ridiculous to say, but it did. It felt like I had no masculinity. I felt exposed, like somebody is going to see through me. It was embarrassing. It was humiliating. And I'm not looking for sympathy when I say that. I'm saying it because if you know someone who does abusive behavior, it's going to be very difficult for them to switch over, to make the change. Because it does involve admitting that your entire life, your identity was toxic or unhealthy in some way. I mean, imagine admitting that. That is so hard to do. But if the abusive person does it, if they admit, my behavior has been toxic all my life, if they're willing to admit that, and they're willing to ask, what do I need to do to change this? And they're also willing to let go of trying to control others, because that's the big one. If they are willing to let that go and let people be who they are, then you might start to see the seeds of change start to grow. And if you see those seeds of change start to grow, then we have to water them and continue to help them grow daily, because what's going to happen is they're going to continue taking 2 steps forward and 3 steps back. And sometimes they'll take 4 steps forward and 2 steps back. And sometimes 5 steps forward and 6 steps back, but hopefully they're taking more steps forward than they are taking back. What I mean by that is I worked on my judgments for years. I did not want to judge anyone in my life ever again. That's how much I just wanted it out of my life, because the feeling of always being on guard waiting for someone to do something that I was going to judge felt awful to me. I didn't like carrying it around. I don't like that feeling. And one who is critical or abusive in any way, they most likely have this feeling, unless they're fully narcissist. The narcissist doesn't really care. The sociopath doesn't really care. If they don't care, then that's a different story. But I'm talking about the people who actually care, the people who have empathy and sympathy, but the feeling of wanting to control and be critical of others, it overrides that sympathy and empathy, and that's what's controlling their life. But when that disappeared, the feeling of wanting to control my partner, when that went away, it was a new feeling I'd never experienced in my life. I never had the absence of that burden in my life. And that was something new and unique, and I had to figure it out. It made me feel so much lighter. It made me enjoy life. It made me enjoy my relationships. It changed my very identity, it felt like. It felt like I had a complete emotional makeover. It was just so different because I'd never experienced it before. Meaning it was always in there. Even at the beginning of any relationship I'd ever been in, it was always in there underneath, even if I couldn't feel it. Because the beginning of a relationship, they have what they call that 1 or 2 month honeymoon period where everything is perfect. Nothing can go wrong. They can do nothing wrong. You love them. You're loving spending time with them. Intimacy is awesome. Everything is great. And that's when the triggers aren't present, typically. The triggers become present when we start settling in. This is why I say don't fall in love fast. Don't fall in love fast because the triggers need time to appear. You need to know what their emotional triggers are as you go forward. And so bringing this back to my original point, which is the fact that we will have incompatibilities, think about the incompatibilities in your life with someone you love or someone that you're in a relationship with, and ask yourself if that was an emotional trigger for them. If one of you likes to invite a lot of friends over and the other one just wants a quiet night, was that an argument? Did that turn into something bigger than it needed to be? Because if it did, was that something that stayed, even though your future arguments weren't necessarily about that particular subject? What I mean by that is sometimes you will have a conflict or an incompatibility at the beginning, and you'll have a conversation about it, and there'll be no resolve to it. There'll be no resolution. So you'll go forward thinking, well, there's nothing we can do. We'll just agree to disagree. Yet it stays inside as a negative emotion, never healed, never reaching closure, never addressed again. And the other things that you argue about might have its roots in that emotional feeling that you're carrying around. A good example of that is, I'll use the smoker versus the non-smoker, for example. Let's just say that the non-smoker accepts that their partner or their loved one smokes, and they don't complain about it, they don't talk about it. It's just something they accept. The smoker goes outside, he or she follows all the rules, great. And now they have a somewhat good relationship, but every now and then they have these weird arguments about minor things. And they escalate and they get heated, and then they're mad at each other, and then they don't talk for a day or two or a week or whatever. They just get into these spats, and all this emotional energy is associated with the upset, and you can't figure out why you're so darn upset about that. It was just about the toilet seat. It was just about the socks on the floor. All the stupid stuff that we go through in relationships sometimes. Why am I so angry about it? Well, I bet you can often connect it to something that upset you near the beginning of the relationship. And what you've done is transform the negative energy and took it away from the original subject, in this example, smoking, and applied it to another subject. So this starts to generalize your negativity into other areas of the relationship. And when that happens, again, emotionally abusive behavior can form. Because the person holding on to the negativity, if they're exploding at different times and you're not sure why, it's quite possible that they've held on to something and not resolved it in themselves. And it may not even have to do with this relationship. It could be a previous relationship, or it could be like what I went through in childhood, some unresolved emotional trauma, some past trauma that turned into dysfunction in the relationship. Those are the emotional triggers that we carry around. And if it didn't start in your relationship, then it's going to be hard to resolve in the relationship, because if it did start in childhood, then what you're dealing with is unhealed trauma of some sort. And so that needs to be addressed personally within the person experiencing it. And that can be tough to heal from. That's what I went through. It was very tough to heal from something in my childhood, because my childhood is over. It's not there anymore. I can't sit down in my childlike state and examine my environment and examine my parents and look at all the influencers in my environment, the bullies and my sisters and my brothers, and think, what is happening here that's causing me to act this way? Because I'm no longer a child. So looking at it from the adult perspective, we tend to leave some of that childhood behind because we don't want to experience that anymore. But if we never address it, and we never think about the emotional triggers that we have today and how they started when we were younger, then we may not ever be able to get past some bad behaviors, or at least the bad behaviors that can form from the emotional triggers that came from childhood. And I'm only talking about people that have emotional triggers, haven't dealt with them, and turn them into bad behavior. I'm talking about people that simply take out their unhealed emotional traumas or triggers onto other people, and not necessarily the ones that are just facing it in themselves. For example, my wife was facing her own challenges, her own challenge with eating and stuff like that, in herself. She never really introduced that challenge into the relationship. She didn't turn it into an us thing. She knew it was a her thing. She knew it was a me thing, meaning her. And I made it an us thing. I turned it into a relationship thing. She didn't want to do that. And looking back, I definitely shouldn't have done that. That was her challenge, and I should have been supportive about her challenges. I should have been the person who says, hey, anything you need from me, I'm here. But I was not that at all. I was the opposite. I was the one who wanted her to stop. And this is what happens. This is what emotionally abusive people want to do. They want to stop you from doing behavior they don't like. And let me just say this. If you do end up changing your behavior to please an emotionally abusive person, typically it won't be good enough. And I hate to break that to you. Let's just say that the emotionally abusive person wants you to stop drinking because they have a problem with people who drink. And you say, okay, I'm going to stop drinking. It won't be the drinking that sets them off next. It'll be something that reminds them of whoever drank in their life, whoever was the addict, whoever was the drunk, whatever it is in their life, whether in the past relationship or in their childhood, that they're going to see behaviors that they're going to attribute to that type of personality. So even if you stop the exact behavior, you may still have to face the brunt of their old perceptions about what personalities are dangerous to them, or they don't like, or they're afraid of, whatever it is. Whatever personality characteristics that they don't like, if they see them in you, regardless of the behavior, then you may still face bad behavior from them. And that puts you in a tough position, because that means exactly what I'm saying. It means that they may not ever be satisfied with anything you do. You may never be able to do anything that makes them happy. But this is also good news in a way, because it means that you don't have to continue trying so damn hard to please them. You don't. You don't have to continue trying hard. In fact, look at the past and try to recall if any behavior you changed made things better. Now, I know there are people that are going to say, yes, when I changed this behavior, things got better. And there are other people that are going to say, no, when I changed that behavior, things were the same, or they continued getting worse. For the people who changed their behavior and things got better, let me ask you this. Do you carry resentment about that? If you carry resentment about that, things didn't get better. Things either stayed the same or got worse. I want you to be really careful about continuing to try to please the person who seems to be unpleasable, because it only weakens you and makes them more controlling and have more power over you, and not in a good way, not in a loving, here's my hand, I'll take you through the fire kind of way. This is a power over you where it feels like an emotional prison. I don't want you to be in an emotional prison. I want you to be emotionally free to be who you are and who you want to be. And when you are with someone who's loving and supporting and kind and generous and caring, that's what you should feel. You should feel those things. So if you're carrying around this negativity and you're feeling criticized by your partner or any loved one, and you just don't know how to please them, it's not you. And let me just give you this as a kind of a final note for this episode. And I've said this before, the kindest, most caring, compassionate, loving, supportive people are typically the ones that can be taken advantage of. And because of that, you have to be more diligent in what type of behavior you'll allow in your life. That doesn't mean you be less kind and less supportive and less compassionate and less caring. No, that doesn't mean any of that. That just means you have to be careful who you allow into your life that takes advantage of that. Because if you're all those things, kind, caring, and supportive, and loving, and generous, and all that stuff, and someone still puts you down and makes you feel bad, that is the unhealed trauma or emotional triggers in them, and it has nothing to do with being who you are. Except that you need to be more diligent and be careful and discerning about who you let into your life and what kind of behavior you let into your life. Because once that behavior's in, this is the tough part. The kind, caring, supportive, generous person finds it very difficult to get it out because they're just too nice. I see this a lot. People mistreating kind people, but the kind person is too nice to stop the mistreatment. And when you are, quote, too kind to stop the mistreatment, you're not actually being kind enough to yourself. Just remember that. I want you to be kind, caring, and compassionate and loving and supportive toward yourself so that you don't let behavior like that into your life. Because once it's in there, it can be hard to be that other person that honors his or her boundaries and pushes that bad behavior out because you might be too nice. Now, if it's already in there, yes, you might have to access a stronger part of you. But that strength comes from self-love and self-compassion and caring so much about yourself that you will not allow bad behavior in your life. And you will do everything you can to make sure that it is filtered out of your life so that you can enjoy life, so that you can be happy. And people who love you and care about you and support you will want to see you happy. Just remember that. People who love you want to see you happy. People who care about you want to see you happy. They don't want to see you upset or crying about something that they did or said. They'll be hurt if they discover that they hurt you. That's the kind of person that cares, where they feel hurt that they hurt you. If they're not feeling hurt that they hurt you, then you may have a different type of relationship and it does not sound healthy, and I hope that's not you, but if it is, it's time to give yourself so much self-love and so much care because somebody else who is supposed to be doing it isn't doing it. And you deserve to be treated better. Share this with others that might benefit. Love and Abuse is the official podcast of the MEAN Workbook, an assessment and healing guide for difficult relationships. It contains a 200-point checklist to help you not only pinpoint the exact behaviors causing the difficulties in your relationship, but it will also clearly reveal to you why you leave so many interactions feeling bad. The workbook is perfect for you if you need proof that you're not losing your mind, or you just need conclusive information to help you make the next best relationship decisions for both of you. You can also use the workbook on yourself to understand your own behaviors and how they affect those you love. It's available for download at loveandabuse.com. Not all emotionally abusive relationships have to end. Some can heal and grow from the challenges, and some can't. It takes both people willing to be honest and working on themselves, knowing that they play a role in what might be happening. If you're the only one working on the relationship, then you probably already feel alone. But know that this show exists to remind you that you are not alone and you're not going crazy. You deserve to be treated with respect and kindness. You deserve honesty and sincerity. You deserve to be treated as worthy and significant because you are. Thanks for joining me. We'll talk again soon.